When you think of ancient Greece, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Philosophy, right? Democracy, the majestic Parthenon, Socrates, Aristotle, the very foundations of Western civilization. But there's a dark, brutal flip side to that glittering coin. Because, ironically, the society that gave us the idea of freedom was utterly ruthless towards its slaves. And I'm not just editorializing. Their most famous thinkers, the intellectual giants, literally called slaves living tools. In their world, only free citizens were considered fully human. Everyone else was an outsider, a xenos, with no rights, no status. That's where we get the word xenophobia, by the way. And this whole grand economy, this entire culture, was built on the backs of men and women who were treated like objects. So, where did all these enslaved women come from? There were basically three paths into this life, and every single one is horrifying. First and most obvious, war. If your city was conquered, all the women and girls became part of the spoils. The second path, less common but still a chilling reality, was being sold by your own parents. Yes, you heard that right. A father could sell his own daughter into slavery for certain sins, like what they called excessive debauchery. And the third, most heartbreaking path was being abandoned as an infant. Babies, sometimes just wrapped in rags, would be left on the street. By law, anyone who found that child had the full right to raise them as their personal slave. From that moment, the child's life was no longer their own. And from that point on, a journey of pain began. Next stop, the slave market. Just picture this scene. Young girls and women standing on a platform, being inspected like cattle by potential buyers who would assess them before making a purchase. Once a woman was sold, her fate depended entirely on where she was taken. If she was bought for household work, the mistress of the house, the legal wife, would decide her duties. She might be sent to the kitchen, to the laundry, or to weave and sew. If a slave showed she had good taste, she might get the better job of being a lady's maid, dressing her mistress, and doing her hair. If the mistress was happy, she might get a treat. If not, she could be slapped or beaten. But if a young woman was bought to satisfy the master's personal desires, that was a whole different story. Although, to be fair, in either situation, an enslaved woman in the house was caught between two fires. Just think about it. The official wife lived in constant fear that this new, younger slave might capture her husband's affection. At the same time, the head housekeeper, who was often an older, trusted slave herself, saw the newcomer as a threat who could replace her, getting her thrown out on the street. So their interests aligned perfectly. And the plotting would begin. The women of the household would use any means necessary to get rid of the competition. They might subtly convince the husband to sell her, or worse, they might frame her for some household disaster, an offense for which she could be legally killed. And here's the truly chilling part. The owner faced zero consequences for her death. In their minds, he bought an item. The item broke, and it was his absolute right to dispose of it. For the ancient Greeks, this wasn't barbaric, it was just logic. A slave was like a cheap watch. If it stops working, you just throw it away. Of course, this was mostly a luxury for the rich. In poor families, you couldn't just kill a slave on a whim. Who would do the work? Besides, a new one was expensive. But let's be honest, women were often bought for one simple purpose: sex. They were kept as concubines, or palakai. Both old and young Greek men bought them, the elderly for care and companionship, and the young to, gain some experience before marriage. A Palakis had an endless list of duties. She cleaned her master's clothes, prepared his bath, served at the dinner table, and, of course, was available for his every sexual need. And if guests came over, she could be ordered, at her master's command, to please any of them. What about children born from this arrangement? They were considered the master's property, plain and simple, with no rights to citizenship or even to life. The master alone could decide whether the baby lived or was drowned. In another wild practice, a master could essentially rent out his palakis to another man for a one-time service. The law even set a maximum rate for this. For example, the so-called flute girls, slaves who entertained guests with music, couldn't be charged out for more than 2 drachmas for special privileges. Though there were exceptions, history records a case where an owner held a literal bidding war during a feast. A beautiful young flute girl was put up for auction on the spot. The highest bidder got to retire with her to a private room right then and there. And here's a wild little detail. The world-famous Socrates himself attended at least one of these parties. We know this thanks to the historian Xenophon, who described a feast at the house of a nobleman named Callias. After dinner, the entertainment was brought out. A flute girl, an acrobat, and a handsome boy who played the lyre. Xenophon notes that Socrates told the host, "By Zeus, Callias, you are entertaining us splendidly." Now, the historian doesn't go into the gritty details of what happened next, but as we've established, these flute girls did more than just play beautiful music. Another destination for enslaved women was the brothel. Girls ended up there either straight from the slave market or after being sold off by a master. They were taught the trade, and the services happened either inside or out in the back alleys. Here, too, the prices were strictly regulated by law. A basic street service cost about 1/6 of a drachma, and naturally, every single coin earned went to the brothel owner, as a slave had no right to own anything. So, was there any way out of this hell? Theoretically, yes, a slave could gain her freedom. But it was almost entirely theoretical. Yet in the history of ancient Greece, there is one incredible, notorious case. A woman named Neaera. She endured a long and brutal path, but achieved the impossible. She became the official wife of a free Greek citizen and had his children. But the free citizens were outraged. The children of a former slave becoming citizens? Unthinkable. During her trial, a prosecutor's words laid their worldview bare. Women like this will have the power to marry whomever they please, and our laws will become meaningless. It's precisely because of that trial that we have such a detailed, harrowing account of her life. It began grimly. Neaera was bought by 2 young men who shared her. She was forced to serve them and any guests they brought home. As one of her owners, Lysias, bluntly put it, she was mutual property. Later, she was sold to another man, Phrynion. At one of his drunken parties, something unimaginable happened. He forced Neaera to be with every single one of his male guests, and then with all of his male slaves. Finally, some women were enslaved to the temples themselves. They were called hierodules, or temple slaves. Their job was to thank male worshippers for their offerings in a very specific, physical way. And when any of these women, from the home, the brothel, or the temple, became too old or sick to be of use, they were, without a second thought, thrown out into the street to live on whatever charity they could find.